Welcome back. This is our final panel discussion of the day with the title, Women in Religious Leadership, Has Anything Changed? And it is quite a panel I feel I'm among here. Thank you for all being here. We've got Professor Linda Woodhead, FD Morris Chair in Moral and Social Theology at King's College London, Dr. Maryyum Mehmood, I've got all sorts of things for you. I don't know if I should say them all. Let's go for it. Teaching Fellow at the University of Birmingham, Associate Director, Edward Cadbury Centre for Public Understanding of Religion, and a Trustee for the Women's Interfaith Network. Yes? Good. You've got a microphone there, good. The Right Reverend Dr. Joe Bailey-Wells, Bishop of Dorking in the Church of England Diocese of Guildford, and I should say that Joe is my bishop, so that's lovely. And Rabbi Debbie Young-Somers, Rabbi at Edgware and Hendon Reform Synagogue and Radio 2 Pulse for Thought contributor over many years and all sorts of other broadcasting bits and bobs as well. On the surface, and certainly in terms of visibility, it does look like there's been a huge change over the past few decades. And maybe we can start by looking at the last, maybe 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, a few decades. And I'd like to start with you, Linda, as an expert in religion, but not actually kind of sitting within it, so to speak, to give us some maybe initial headlines as to how you assess where we are now with women in religious leadership, as opposed to perhaps where we were 30 or 40 years ago.
Well, I suppose we're starting in this country.
Yep.
And we'll start with the Christian churches. And really, women's leadership came relatively late in this country. So if you take Scandinavia, for example, women were ordained in the 1950s. So there's a much, much longer period. In the Church of England, what was it, Joe, 1994, the first women priests. So not that long ago. And I'm starting with them because they're the biggest religions, and so that makes women's leadership very visible. And it's not as straightforward a question as you might think, what difference it made, because women came in sort of sideways and in various, not straightforwardly as ordained priests. A lot of women, more women, are non-stipendiary, not paid, and lots of factors like that make it really hard to say, what difference has it made. At the same time, you see women taking leadership roles from the 1940s onwards, really, in alternative spiritualities. So, for example, Wicca, which is the only religion England's ever offered the world, and very, very influential, women were central to the formation and the leadership. And witchcraft, alternative spirituality, New Age, as well as much older things like spiritualism, fortune-telling, tarot reading. All these things have done luxuriantly well, and women have been very, very central in that. So I think we want to look at the whole picture. I'm leaving out other religions because there are people here who know a little bit about that. But I'm trying to paint a sort of big picture, a big complex picture of women being let into institutions they had been excluded from quite late in the day, but also this huge penumbra of other activities in which they're more central for longer.
Well, maybe with a Muslim, a Jewish and a Christian contributor on the panel, maybe we can start by each saying something about maybe what I'd have seen if I'd gone into a mosque, a synagogue or a church 30, 40 years ago, and what might be different now. So maybe, Debbie, can you start with that?
So I think I come from a very privileged place in that if you'd walked into my synagogue 30, 40 years ago, as I was growing up, I didn't know men could be rabbis. From about 1985, my synagogue had one woman and then another. And I grew up in that context.
So that's what you saw, that was the model.
And that modelling was crucial to me knowing that this was something I could do. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but I knew I could do it if I wanted to. And I feel incredibly indebted and grateful to the women of the 1970s, really, who fought that battle. Rabbi Jackie Tabak was the first in the UK in 1975. We had it in America a couple of years earlier. And, I mean, I think the model of what it means to be a woman rabbi has shifted over those years, as what it means to be a woman has shifted over those years in some ways. But I think change in many places has come much slower than it did in my personal community growing up. The community I now serve, I was a student rabbi there 13, 14 years ago, and I was the first woman to take all of the High Holy Day services. They'd had big fights over whether women could carry the scroll, and this is in a reform context where we think it's all founded on feminism. Actually, of course it wasn't. There was separate seating until the 1960s in some synagogues. Orthodox women are now able, in sort of very side niche communities, to also seek ordination, which is a new thing that's emerged in the last 5 years. But actually, the first woman rabbi was ordained in 1935 in Germany, and that's another story for another day. But let's not assume that we are always as groundbreaking as we think. The strange thing about our rabbi in 1935, Regina Jonas, is that nobody talked about her after Auschwitz. She died in Auschwitz, and nobody talked about her after the war. So we didn't actually know that she'd been ordained until 1991, after we'd already done it again.
Wow. That is another story for another time, but let's tell that story another time. Maryyum, in a mosque 30, 40 years ago, what would I have seen? Who would I have seen? How different is it now?
Firstly, thank you so much for including me on this wonderful, wonderful panel. And I've so much to learn from such heavyweights, in their various different fields. I think, before I come to the question about mosques, you mentioned various different hats that I wear. I just wanted to confirm that today I'm talking primarily as a faith leaders trainer. So at the Cadbury Centre for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham, I am privileged to convene, deliver, design, completely run, alongside with the director, Andrew Davis, we run a Master's in Public Administration in Faith-Based Leadership. Now, as such, the meaning of leadership, to me, with an academic hat on, is really important to sort of deconstruct and understand, to see what change really means and how we measure impactful change, whether it's successful or not. We really need to understand what is the meaning of leadership. And religious leadership or faith-based leadership, some people think that there is an obvious distinction between the two, but I might use those interchangeably and then get to that. Within the Muslim spaces, I'd rather say spaces than communities because they're spread everywhere. In some places, a community hub might look very different in a Muslim space than it does in various other communities. And specifically within British Muslim spaces, there is a wide array of different interpretations, not just of text, but also of what leadership means to women, to people. And 30 years ago, it might have meant something else. That's not to say, everyone who was traditionalist and staunchly orthodox in their understanding is now suddenly progressive. We've had so many changes, not just the pandemic, but prior to that even, hyperglobalization, rapid, expansion and innovation in tech. All of these things really reflect and affect what we do in our communities and our societies. So, leadership for Muslim women doesn't just mean, just because many Orthodox communities, Muslim communities, they might not want to, might not wish to preach at a pulpit. Does that make them any less of a leader in their own right? And some people say, well, we need to detach our understanding of traditional leadership from patriarchal and misogynistic understandings of what it means to be a leader. And I would agree with that, because I don't think tradition is to be set in a binary with progressivism. Progressive traditions exist, and they've outdate and long stand prior to even the Me Too movement. Within the Islamic tradition, it is rich with feminist understandings and interpretations of what it means to be a leader. There are community leaders who I teach who are women from across the faith spectrum, and many of them do not stand at a pulpit. Many of them do. And what we need to acknowledge and embrace is the diversity and plurality from within those traditions.
No, that makes perfect sense. It is fair to say, though, isn't it, that over the last 30 or 40 years, women in what would have been seen as traditional leadership roles have become more visible in some faith traditions, more than others. And I mean, the Christian tradition, and particularly the Church of England, that's very much been the case. So, Jo, say a bit about 30 years ago as opposed to now.
So 30 years ago, all clergy would have been robed. Nearly every church would have had pews. Now we have more informal church. We have more, I might call it shopfront church, but churches meeting in non-ecclesial settings, and certainly more women leading, but also lay people leading.
So leadership isn't just about being ordained.
Children's voices involved. You know, all-age worship wasn't a thing when I was growing up. Children were seen and not heard on the whole, or they went out to Sunday school. So there is a broader diversity generally within which women's leadership is welcomed, but it's part of a bigger whole. Thank goodness.
But certainly, when you were growing up, when I was growing up, and I grew up in the Anglican Church, there weren't women vicars. I mean, it's really very simple from that point of view.
Absolutely.
And certainly nobody...
Did I miss that little detail?
You kind of missed that detail. And certainly nobody
all
like
male,
you dressed in a
all in
shirt.
robes, all at the front. In my church, sort of very middle Anglican village church, even the servers had to be male.
So anyone that was kind of there helping near the altar, part of that... male.
And you even had to be a grown-up. I remember my father laughing at a neighbour who said he's dressing up like a boy. Right. But the point is, even a boy couldn't do it.
I mean, would I be right in saying that when you started training, women couldn't be ordained?
That's true. So
I mean, that's something of what you might call a step of faith.
Yes, indeed. When I went forward, I remember at my selection conference equivalent, I was specifically asked, how would you feel if the ordination of women to the priesthood did not go through? It was sort of being discussed. And I said, I'm well aware it might not go through. I'm offering myself for whatever I'm able to do.
Right.
I would have been immensely frustrated, but I was still committed to going for it anyway. And to be honest, I think I was pretty confident it would go through, but I wasn't at all sure it would go through in 1992 when it went through by a whisker.
I wonder, and maybe Linda, Maryyum, you can talk about this. Do faith communities watch each other to see what's happening in terms of their sort of demographic, in terms of women who are moving into leadership positions, being given permission to take various leadership positions? I just wonder if different faith groups watch each other to see what's happening and whether that then has an impact on what they do, or is it much more kind of personal than that in terms of what we as a religion can do?
Well, I think they watch each other more within their own camp. So Christian churches watch other Christian churches more. And, for example, the Catholic Church and the Church of England have always watched each other very closely. So when the Church of England came out in favour of contraception, for example, amongst married couples, that's when the prohibition was imposed by the Catholic Church because they wanted to put clear blue water between the two. So they do, but it's
so influence other in
they compete, ways. But often by opposing one another rather than necessarily aping one another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think that's really interesting, and kind of observing the ways in which communities of faith interact and engage in interfaith. They do interfaith, not just by, gone are the days of like sitting down, singing Kumbaya, and, everyone's really happy with one another. Actually, what I see, and sort of as an academic, as well as somebody who practices interfaith, we learn by watching, observing, and really understanding one another. And a classic example, I think, of this, especially women leading the way, is when it comes to challenging abuses, especially violence against women and children, in faith-based spaces, spiritual abuse in those spaces. It's women who are unfortunately the most affected and impacted by it, but they're also the ones leading that way, championing the cause. And what I've seen is that the best sort of outputs and outcomes in terms of changing people's mindsets around these things happen when women of faith extend their hand in solidarity with other women of faith in different communities. And it's, we've had the domestic abuse bill, and lots of women of faith championed to have coercive control in faith-based spaces recognized as a form of abuse, and and spiritual abuse as well. And I'm really, I admire those women, and I'm so happy to be part of those spaces, not just as a Muslim, but as a woman, as a British person, as somebody who's of a certain ethnic heritage.
Can I say something naughty? Do women do that kind of thing better than men? I mean, I'm just...
Definitely.
There you go. Wasn't naughty at all.
Is that naughty?
No, maybe not. Maybe not.
I wish you courage in that case. But that's I want to jump in on Maryyum, because I want to say, going back into the Old Testament, I think women have always done that. Women have been community organising. Look at the women around David. He had lots of them. Okay. They were concubines, they didn't have any formal power, but my goodness, did they influence what he did by manipulative means if necessary.
Can I also piggyback a little bit on what Maryyum was saying, because I think it's really true and interesting. I would say 20 years ago, when I was asked to speak, it was actually often tokenistic. We want a young female, let's get her. Oh, and she's a Jew, even better. And I think that tokenism, in particularly in media sense, has been really fascinating. And actually, I remember sitting in a dialogue space where there was a group of about 10 of us. I was the only Jewish woman. There was one Christian woman, and she left the group. And I said, "Can we please replace her with another woman?" And I was told there wasn't anyone qualified, which I find astonishing. And from that moment on, I actually consciously decided that those interfaith relationships I was going to really work on were female. And I have many meaningful relationships with men and women from across different faiths. Rather than watching other faiths, I really learn in dialogue with my colleagues, whether they're ordained or not, because we, particularly, in the world that we live in, we do experience very similar things. In serving our communities, the challenges we face can be very similar. And actually studying our theology together can be really enlightening, hearing that theology lived through another woman's experience and another man's experience, another person's experience. But, I have found, rather than watching other faiths, I've just wanted to learn with particularly female colleagues.
Linda?
I think the internet is incredibly important here, and Maryyum made me think about that, because it's allowed in religion, it's allowed a voice for groups who have felt abused or marginalised or oppressed to meet one another, often across geographical, regions and whatever. That was never possible before, and it allows them to build up a critical mass to really make an impact, including in some very, very conservative faiths, both Christian and non-faith. That's really noticeable, that how change comes through that. And it's back to your point about informal leadership, not necessarily the formal leaders, bringing change from the margins in that way.
Exactly. Can I just piggyback on that? Yeah. I love this. It's such sisterhood, at play. You mentioned the margins, and this is exactly what I wanted to, if there's one message I wanted to get across here, is that we shouldn't be looking at this entire conversation as a binary between the powerful and the powerless. It goes back to taking a leaf from Black feminist American activists such as Bell Hooks. So her feminist theory, if anyone's read it, it is about from margin to center. It's about understanding that power or authority isn't to be understood as just being concentrated at the center. But actually, if we transform our understanding of what authority means and recognize we all have agency, we all have that authority. It is about recognizing it. It is about celebrating it. Can I make a controversial joke?
Yes.
Just to liven things up. It goes back to the bishop's point about rooted in tradition and how traditions are enriched with feminist understandings. It's not a new thing. I often, when I was younger, I used to ask my mum about prophets within the Islamic faith. And we are told there are several thousand, many of them we don't even know about. And I said, are any of them women? And she said, what's stopping us from understanding that in that way? And she goes, yes, many probably were. She believes that many were prophetesses, but they're probably burnt at stake. Now imagine saying that to like a 12-year-old. My mum has a really dark sense of humor. She's not here today, but these are the sort of things that we need to kind of recognize that might be the case. A lot of our histories as, of traditions, they never intended to sideline women. It is our interpretations and our lived experiences of the faith that often cast aside marginalised as well as women.
So, I mean, I know so many examples of women in interfaith settings working together in all kinds of ways. I can see several women in the audience who I know do this. But I wonder, and there's always a backlash when women put their head above the parapet in all kinds of different ways. But I just wonder whether the backlash and the criticism is different in a religious context. Is it more pointed? Is it more specific? Is it easier for people to be critical because of what they can hang that on, perhaps scripturally?
Well, let's say one obvious important point, which is that religions tend to be voluntary organisations, so you can just leave.
Yeah.
So whereas lots of other institutions and workplaces, it's much harder. That just led to a huge number leaving. That's part of the big story as well. And if you think about the role that the churches had in society until the 70s, 80s, in terms of training teachers, training nurses, they had their own education colleges, their own nursing colleges. They were incredibly central in all those activities of lay women leadership, informal leadership. A lot of those women just left. So, huge numbers were kind of lost because... not just because there weren't leadership opportunities for them,
the sort of structures possible,
but they just went off and did it for themselves. When I was doing research in Kendal in 2002, looking at every kind of religion and spirituality there, in the huge alternative spirituality sector, a lot of the women there who'd made it an occupation were refugees from the churches and from the health service, where they felt they couldn't do the kind of holistic healing they wanted. So, as well as this story about change within the institutions and around the margins of them, there was a big exodus from, actually over 100 years, but bit by bit. And that is part of the story of decline of religious institutions as well, that they didn't keep a lot of women.
Mm-hmm. And those women found opportunities to carry out the roles that they felt they should carry out in other contexts.
It was the church that provided an opportunity for women in the 19th century to have public roles and be part of voluntary organisations and the first half of the 20th century. And then you suddenly get, after the Second World War, a lot more opportunities opening up for women. And that's a big part of the story of what the churches and other religions had to contend with.
How would you respond to that, Jo?
I mean, when you do something for your faith, you're doing it from the bottom of your heart. You're doing it with the whole of your being. So I do think there's a sense in which, there's more at stake. And therefore, we're likely to react more wholly when something goes wrong, when we get angry, because you're judging my values, you're judging my children, you're not just judging my source of income. I think it's just a more holistic enterprise. In that sense, I think it's very healthy. I also want to say, certainly in my own experience, I could dwell on the negative stuff. I try to make a discipline of not doing so. But the people who might not share my faith, but support the fact that I'm in the role, is utterly phenomenal. Far outnumbers the opposition.
So how do you experience that?
Oh, even on a bus. Actually, coming here on the tube with my fold-up bike, it fell over on the overground line from Clapham Junction, whatever line that is, the Stratford line. And a lovely Rasta guy, I was on my phone and talking about something in Ukraine for next week, and he said, "Let me hold your bike." And he literally just put his foot there so it wasn't going to fall over again. And then he said, "I love it that you're in a collar." I don't know if he knew what it meant. Well, I guess he wouldn't have said it otherwise. But, coming from Jamaica, he was saying there's something radical. He was just trying to help me when I was doing too many things at once.
But is that your kind of overwhelming experience of that kind of reaction?
I mean, apart from the people that haven't the foggiest, which is also delightful, actually, you know, this no longer speaks in the way a generation ago. I think it was obvious in that's fine. It is broadly my experience. Yeah. Yeah. On a train, random people will say, "Go for it," more than they will say, "Who are you?" You know.
And actually, I think that allyship is really something I experience.
Women and men.
Yes, absolutely. You know, having my male colleagues, my non-binary colleagues, whoever it is, stand up when someone says, "Oh, I'm not sure I want a woman doing that funeral." And them saying, "Well, then we're not the right synagogue for you." Or, you know, actually, I don't have to say that now. It's my male colleagues that do that.
And thinking about how it might have been a while ago, that would have been different, would it?
Certainly in my community, I think every community functions in its own way. I think, you know, particularly around death, for example, you don't want to upset a family. Sure. They've just been bereaved. But actually, you know, so my instinct is to say, well, of course, you know, we'll find another way, don't worry. But when it comes to life cycle moments, my colleagues are now saying, well, if they don't want a woman, we're not the right community. And it has happened far less than I thought it would happen, which is comforting. But it also means that we have to be allies. So I remember about 13, 14 years ago, I was at a Friday night dinner and an elderly couple leant over to me and said, "Oh, it's so nice to meet a student rabbi who's a woman and isn't a lesbian." And I was like, I mean, what do you know about my background? But actually, you know, I want to challenge people and say, isn't it wonderful that I just did a wedding for 2 brides? And to celebrate all the diversity in our communities, not just women's leadership. And for us to be allies for each other and for everyone. I think, you know, when you're not employing 50% of the community, you're missing out on 50% of the talent. So it's an own goal, really.
Can we go back? I know it's not... it maybe feels negative, and I know that's not what you want to focus on, but I think it is it's so much a part of now in social media, particularly the kind of criticism that all sorts of people in all kinds of contexts get. And we know that women get a lot of criticism, and it's much more serious than that. But just to go back to this question about whether it's easier to be critical somehow in a religious context because there are inevitably parts of Scripture that people can grab hold of and throw.
They're being very selective, though. You know, I can select other bits of Scripture and make the other argument. It's a pick and mix, right? Mm-hmm. I actually think social media is a huge, huge issue. I feel far more vulnerabilities exist on social media than in the real world in many ways. People are very nervous of saying what they would say on social media to my face. And I particularly see it actually for my Christian clergy friends on social media. I think there are almost troops of people out attacking my female clergy friends and, you know, wading into those spaces. And unfortunately, it is so often anonymized. And I think that is a huge challenge that we face as a society of how we hold that anonymous abuse.
Joe?
Yeah, I try not to read it. I mean, I do think there's a discipline about it. I suppose I'm sticking my head in the sand by saying that, but I do think we have a choice more often than we think we have. So I'm trying not to get into victim mode and say, I don't have to be offended. I don't have to read that. And certainly not get into a place where you then need to defend yourself, which usually means throwing some mud back and putting others down, which is what religious people have done for centuries, have we not? I speak for my own. So, I mean, perhaps I've got off lightly, but I've certainly seen really ugly stuff that I'm utterly ashamed of coming from my own church, and even people I know and might previously have called friends. It makes one gasp. But I think I have a bin called, human nature. And I know on a bad day, I could go there too. Perhaps my dog rescues me by saying it's time to go for a walk. You know, sometimes we just have to get over ourselves.
That's really unfortunate. And I'm, in a different capacity, I guess I have experienced onslaught from people on social media. And it's really devastating that, you can't really do anything about it because they're anonymized. But I think we ought to take a little step back and, to your question about, is it easier because religion is weaponized or, scripture is, I would say, let's think broadly of the culture that we live in, and the fact that toxic masculinity, or masculinity that has been really, I'm lost for words because, you see incel movements, you see those, and you see that rhetoric and that mindset is pervasive across the divides, whether it's faith or cultural, and, extremism of any kind, it really does have that at its core. And I think a lot of research is being done now at the moment to see those overlaps. And as such, I think, it's not just about religion per se, it's any ideology or any set of beliefs that can be used or weaponized. So I don't think it's really... It's difficult to say whether religion is easily weaponized, but I think, it goes back to your point made earlier, if something's so dear to you, it being used against you, of course that's going to hurt you tenfold more. But I think, if we were to couch all of this in the discussions currently being had on the media, social media, especially around abortion, and the ways in which women and basically anyone who isn't cisgendered, heteronormative male, or in a position of privilege that is afforded to them, is being attacked. But then on the other hand, we see allies, in faith and in humanity. And I think that is just so beautiful. So we take the good with the bad in that sense. That's how I cope anyway.
Yeah, no. I mean, I wonder whether sometimes the weaponizing of religion, the things that we see and hear that are negative, are what kind of effect that's having on people who may be kind of beginning to tentatively dip a toe in faith. And I know that obviously the census is coming up, and Linda, you've done a lot of work on the nuns, people with no faith, but also the duns, ones that people who might have decided to walk away. So tell us a bit about that, and kind of how that fits into the sort of social context of what we see and hear.
Yes, so I think that conversation we've just heard, I would sum it up by saying that in a way, fundamentalism has won. So people think that if you're really religious, you take a fundamentalist view. There are certain really clear propositions, God's like this, and heterosexual marriage is the only way to live, etc., etc. And that's real religion. And anything less is liberal, wishy-washy, not really sincere. And actually the mainstream media have done a lot of harm there as well by getting on a fundamentalist and an atheist who both have that very simplistic view of what religion is. Yeah. And where most people are just gets blocked out of the debate because it's a bit too complex.
So it gets kind of polarised.
So it gets very polarised. And then it's sort of self-fulfilling because young people think, God, I don't want anything to do with religion. If it's like that, it's absolutely awful. And if those are its spokesmen. And so they say, no, I'm not religious when they're asked on the census, because who would want to have that as part of your identity? Or they'll apologise. I'm a Catholic, but I'm not like the church, or I don't like, I'm Christian, but I don't go to church. And they immediately have to qualify it, because if you say you're religious, people immediately assume all sorts of terrible things about you, which is partly why the word spirituality emerged as an alternative for people. But it's really unfortunate that the discourse is so tainted in this way, and that most religious voices don't get a fair hearing.
No, absolutely. Joe, how do you feel about that when you're sort of around the parishes where you're meeting people? I mean, not just in churches, but in communities as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's little place for subtlety, is what Linda's saying, and I completely agree with that. And religion is nothing if it's not about nuance. Scripture, coming back to our texts, it's really complicated. It's jolly hard to understand. You know, I've got a PhD in biblical studies, and I still find it hard. You know, so how is an average person really expected to get a handle on, you know, yes, there's this, there's that, there's the big picture, there's the you know. So, I mean, I suppose the only answer to that is to narrate and teach and talk and tell stories, contemporary stories that illustrate ancient principles. And, you know, have we still got permission in the public space to tell religious stories? And I think that space has diminished. And certainly patience and attention spans have diminished. And we're competing with sport. You know, I mean, so much else going on. That's not really a moan. It's just very competitive. And we're losing.
Yeah. What would you say about that, Debbie?
Yeah, I think trying to be nuanced on Twitter, for example, really tricky. And I think so quite often when these things are sort of hot flashpoints, my approach is often to say, come and have a conversation with me if you'd like to. And I'm often really privileged by those people who do take that invitation and say, actually, I do want to engage with the nuance. But yes, I think Linda's right that you know, the headline can only ever be fundamental. Although I think there's an interesting debate around who we give a platform to and don't give a platform to. I was on Radio 4 yesterday morning talking about the church's mission to the Jews, which many of my clergy friends were quite shocked to discover is still a paid department of the Church of England. And obviously I'm not entirely in favour of this department's work, find it a little bit aggravating. And people on Facebook were saying, but why would the BBC give a platform to someone like that from the church's mission to the Jews? And I said, because it's a conversation to be had. There's no point in just talking to me. You need to have the debate. And actually, I'd like to think that we sort of undermined the argument somewhat in having the debate, and that people understood there is a path of let's have a dialogue rather than a monologue about what our faith lived means, and that you can witness your faith through living in a particular way without having to actively missionize me. So yeah, I think we can oversimplify things very quickly and easily, and it is hard to get the nuance. But I think it can be done.
We've got a few minutes left. Does anyone... Rosie.
Given that with the Religion Media Conference, I just wonder whether you've any thoughts on the portrayal of religious women and possibly even religious women leaders in the media. I can't think of many examples, and often the way the media does religion best these days is through drama. So priesthood through Sean Bean on Broken, you know, absolutely brilliant. We're a bit of a long way now from the Vicar of Dibley. I mean, so where do you see in the media, or it might be print, it might be mainstream television, it might be radio, I mean, is it Shula on the Archers? I mean, where do we see women leaders portrayed in a way that is not 50 years behind where we actually are?
Like Call the Midwife, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
Transparent has a great woman rabbi in it, who I'm often brought into conversations about. No, I think it's a really fascinating question. There have been the odd radio show with women rabbis fictionalised, but I think actually part of the challenge is what Maryyum was saying earlier, of the diversity of what it looks like to be a woman leader, but also to be a male leader, right? It's, with fiction, it's quite often the sure headline, right? And it's how do we get to that depth in people's lives? And that's trickier.
Can you think of any examples of female religious leaders?
I find myself going back to Lucy Winkett when she was a minor canon at St Paul's Cathedral and there was a documentary. I'm really thrown by your question. I can't...
Yeah, I mean...
Kate
yes.
Botley.
But not in drama, yeah, interesting.
Can I just say, we've taken some time to get away in the Muslim communities being portrayed as terrorist trope to the tokenized, oh, look, this is the good versus bad Muslim, to a Muslim exists, wild Muslim appears out of nowhere, It's just, it's mind-boggling. So that question in itself, I just think there's wonderful representation. Of course, we have wonderful British Muslims, not just Nadia Hussein, but, lots of people out there, women who are wonderful in and of their own right. But when it comes to leadership, I'm kind of thinking, gosh, this could be an idea if there are anyone who wants a pitch or anything. If you want an idea for a show or something, this would be great, a great opportunity. But I really hope that space is being cultivated now. You have in the States a lot of stuff is being done within media, the nexus between media and Muslim spaces with something called the Pillars Fund. And they fund a lot of Muslim creatives to really get out there and represent what it means to be Muslims in the modern day. And I think we need more of that. We need, obviously, nothing can happen without funding, but also I think what we ought to be doing is really listening to people and listening to those communities. So there is plurality within those spaces. But in order to represent that, I think we have a long way to go. But I'm not pessimistic at all. I think the fact that we're here today says a lot.
And that's what this whole day has been about, is about relationships and building relationships and talking to one another.
Quick thing to say, I think it's partly that there's no space where you can have a really serious, in a broad sense, theological discussion about, is there a God? What kind of God? Are there many gods? How do I engage with spirit? What's the nature of my spirit? What's the nature of my meditative or prayer life? These questions are just still, we're such a secular society in that sense, that there aren't good programs, discussions about all those things. The debate about can you call God she is half a century old, and yet the media always get in a great flurry about if anyone ever uses the word she, and it's as if it never happened. So it's not just about women's leadership. It's about a real nervousness about talking about God and gods and spirits as if they're real. And we have a problem in universities, we have a problem in broadcast media, we have a problem in society, I think, with taking the fact seriously that, as Jo said, this is at the heart of many people's lives. And that's very difficult for people for whom it is, who find it it's not very safe to talk about.
Did the Vicar of Dibley change anything for my female colleagues? Because I felt like it changed things for me, and it made something much more approachable. I wondered if it did for you.
I can't say it did. I don't have a very positive perspective on the Vicar of Dibley. I just remember being asked over and over again, so are you like the Vicar of Dibley then?
I was asked that too, though.
Yes. I don't remember what I said. I know I didn't watch it, if I could help it.
Thank you. OK, we will leave it there. Thank you so much to all my guests, Maryyum and Debbie and Linda and Jo. Thanks for being with us.